Welcome. This is a lecture series. Please have your paper and pencils ready to take notes. The better your notes, the more help they will be to you later as you're doing assignments. Let's get started. Today we're discussing the Oklahoma Academic Standard 8.5.R.1. This is for 8th grade, Standard 5, Reading, Point 1. The standard reads, students will recognize the use of verbals, for example, gerunds, participles, and infinitives, and clauses. Please pause the video now and write down what the standard for 8.5.R1 is. So let's talk a little bit about a verbal. The new improved blend of two parts of speech is called a verbal. And verbals are very helpful and they're useful hybrids. And they come in three different forms: gerunds, infinitives, and participles. Please pause the video and write down what a verbal is. Whenever you heard the word verbal, did you wonder if perhaps it was a verb? So is something a verb or a verbal? What's the difference? You cannot just look at the word to determine this. You have to see how that particular word or set of words is used. They both look like verbs, but a verbal is used as something other than the part of speech, a verb. And it's never the verb of that sentence. So this is whenever the verb forms will be used as a noun, an adjective, or an adverb. So if you see something that looks like a verb, but it's used as a noun, an adjective, or an adverb, then it's a verbal. If it looks like a verb and it's used like a verb, then it's a verb. Please pause this screen and write down the definition between a verb and a verbal. Let's discuss gerunds. What is a gerund? A gerund is a combination of a noun and a verb. It's when they're put together. It looks like a verb, but it acts like a noun. And they always end in an ing. However, not all words that end in ing are a gerund. If that ing word is modifying a noun, then it's called a participle. It's not a gerund. Gerunds are nouns. Then there are four ways that they can function: the subject, the direct objects, predicate noun, and preposition. Please pause the video and write down the definitions and explanation of what a gerund is. Let's discuss a little bit about gerund phrases. A gerund phrase is a group of words that begins with that gerund, and then usually it's followed by things like modifiers and direct objects and even prepositional phrases. So let's look at an example here of how it functions as a subject of the sentence. Finding a needle, that's the gerund phrase. Finding a needle in a haystack is easier said than done. So in this particular sentence, the gerund phrase is the subject of the sentence. The subject is finding a needle. So let's look at how a gerund phrase can function as a direct object of a sentence. The direct object here is questioning us on our wrestling knowledge. The whole sentence is, my coach likes questioning us on our wrestling knowledge. So in this particular sentence, the gerund phrase is functioning as a direct object of the sentence. Please pause the video and write down what the definition of a gerund phrase is, and I suggest that you write down the examples as well. Okay, now let's move on to participles. What is a participle? A participle is a form of a verb that functions as an adjective. Then we have two kinds of participles. We have the present participles that end in ing, and then we have the past participles that end in either ed, t, or en. Please pause the video and write down the definition of participles. So what's a participle phrase? This is a group of words that have a participle, modifier, and or direct objects, indirect objects, and or prepositional phrases. Let's look at the examples here. Here's an example of a participle phrase functioning as an adjective. Removing his shoes, Zach ran to the river. So the adjective is the participle phrase, removing his shoes. So let's look at the next example. This is where the participle phrase is functioning as an adjective and it's modifying the word cousin. Anne noticed her cousin Zach running toward the river. Please pause the video and write down the definition of participle phrase. And again, I encourage you to write down the examples as well. Now let's look at infinitives. The word to plus a verb is an infinitive. For an example, to sing, to go, or to dance. Those are infinitives. The preposition except causes the to in the infinitive to disappear. The baby did nothing except lie in the bed. Can you see the invisible to there? The baby did nothing except to lie in the bed. You could write it that way, but that really wouldn't be correct. So you type instead, or you write, the baby did nothing except lie in the bed. So if you use the word except, then that to in the infinitive disappears. We know the baby did nothing except to lie in the bed. So an infinitive is the word to plus a verb. Please pause the screen now and write down the definition and examples of infinitives. Now let's look at infinitives versus prepositional phrases. An infinitive is to plus a verb form. So for example here we have to fly, to draw, or to enter. A prepositional phrase is to plus a noun, a pronoun, and any modifiers. For example, to him, to the mountains, or to this address. So there is a difference. Even though you see the word to, it depends on what's behind it. If it's a verb, it's the infinitive. If it's a noun, a pronoun, or a modifier, then it's a prepositional phrase. Please pause the video and write down the definition between the differences of an infinitive phrase and a prepositional phrase. Let's consider an infinitive phrase. An infinitive phrase is that word that has an infinitive, and it's usually followed by modifiers, direct objects, and/or prepositional phrases. So here, let's look at an example here where the infinitive phrase is functioning as the direct object of the verb. We wanted to leave early. To leave early is the infinitive phrase, and it's functioning as the direct object of that verb that's there. Let's look at the next sentence. I have a chore to perform before I leave. So here the infinitive phrase is functioning like an adjective. To perform before I leave is functioning as an infinitive phrase as an adjective. The third example is where the infinitive phrase is functioning as that direct object of the verb. Charlie agreed to give me a ride. To give me a ride is the infinitive phrase, and that's the direct object of that verb, agreed. Please pause the video and write down the definition of infinitive phrases and the examples as well. Types of clauses. Clauses are a group of related words with a subject and a verb. It is different from a phrase. So let's look at some clauses now. Let's start with independent clauses. An independent clause stands by itself and makes sense. It could be its very own sentence, and it could be a part of a larger one. We have some examples here. Charlie wants to be the goalie this week. Charlie wants to be the goalie this week, but Isaac thinks he will be. So an independent clause, again, can stand by itself and it can make sense all by its own. Please pause the video and write down the definition and examples of independent clause. Now let's talk about subordinate clauses. A subordinate clause cannot stand by itself. It depends on something else for its meaning. Sometimes people call them dependent clauses. For example here, while the turtle crossed the road, the drivers patiently waited inside their cars. We also have the woman who is cooking for us is my mother. And subordinate or dependent clause can also act as an adjective, an adverb, or a noun. Please pause the video and write down the definition of a subordinate clause. Let's look at an adjective clause. An adjective clause is another type of a subordinate clause or dependent clause. It modifies a noun or pronoun in the sentence. It answers the question who, whom, whose, which, or what. For example, people who are in the cooking contest should know how to make chili. Who are in the cooking contest modifies that noun, people. English is the course that my aunt teaches. That adjective clause, that my aunt teaches, modifies English is the course. So it tells us what. What is the course that your aunt teaches? She teaches English. Please pause the video and write down the definition of adjective clause. Let's talk about an adverb clause now. An adverb clause is also a subordinate or dependent clause. The adverb clause modifies a verb, adverb, or an adjective. It's going to tell you how, when, where, why, to what extent, and under what condition. It's important to remember what it's telling us. It is introduced by a subordinating conjunction. For example, it could use words like after or as if, in order that, since, and so that. For example here, because it was snowing, we came inside. Because it was snowing is the adverb clause. In the next example, we went to the soccer game after we ate dinner. The adverb clause here is after we ate dinner. It's telling you what you did when you went there and under what condition. Please pause the video and write down the definition of an adverb clause and include your examples. And finally, let's look at the noun clauses. A noun clause is a subordinate clause or a dependent clause. It functions as a noun. It can basically do anything that a regular noun can do. It can be subject, predicate, nominative, or direct object. There are some words that introduce noun clauses. For example, how, if, that, what, when, where, whose, and why. Let's look at some examples here. The big question is whether he will finish the huge burger. So our noun clause there is whether he will finish the huge burger. The next example is everyone knows that Jim eats at least 2 burgers every day. Did you see the words that introduce the noun clauses in both of these sentences? Whether and that. Those are good clues to determine a noun clause. Please pause the video and write down the definition of a noun clause and the examples. Let's look back at what this particular standard was wanting us to learn. Here in standard 8.5.R.1, they wanted students to recognize the use of verbals, for example, gerunds, participles, and infinitives, and clauses. Now that you have the definitions of what these are, whenever you are reading different passages, you should be able to recognize verbals and clauses. Please practice these skills whenever you're reading passages from your teacher or from your parent, and then take an assessment to ensure that you have mastery of that skill. Thank you very much for joining me today.